Hello, I'm John Stauffer. It's a great pleasure and honor for me to be here with you today on Frederick Douglass Day 2020. I wish I could be with you in person, but I can't. And so I will present a lecture on Zoom, and I will share my screen with you now for several reasons, one of which, and the most important, being that the focus should be on Frederick Douglass rather than myself. So hopefully the focus of the screen is Douglass with the title of the talk. You can see me in a tiny little box, but your focus should be on Douglass. And it's really about Douglass and the way in which he embraced and used photography. You all are familiar with Douglass as the preeminent Black leader in the 19th century, one of the greatest orators in English, certainly in North America, but in my view, and especially as a nonfiction orator, as a writer, abolitionist, his political stature, his friendship with leading statesmen, and influence on them from Lincoln and Sumner to many others. Douglass, as many of you know, was the first African-American to receive a federal appointment that required Senate approval when he was appointed the Marshal of the District of Columbia. He was a master of the genre of autobiography. He published 3 autobiographies. The first 2 were bestsellers, and his second one, which was a bestseller, both the first and the second were bestsellers, but the second one is one of the greatest, in my view, autobiographies in English language, and a brilliant advocacy for racial equality and critique of slavery. What you may not know is that Douglass was also in love with photography, and he considered photography as a crucial aid in helping him to achieve not just freedom, but equality under the law, civil rights and human rights for all people. Douglass sat for his portrait whenever he could. He was often on the road. It was an age in which it was the golden age of oratory, and people could make more money as public speakers than they could as writers. He spoke out against slavery. He spoke out against injustice. He spoke out against racism. And he was, in certainly many periods of his life, away from home more than he was at home. And on the road is where he sat for for most of his photographs. He wrote more frequently on photography than any other American in the 19th century. And he was the most photographed American in the 19th century. My colleagues Zoe Trott and Celeste Bernier in our book Picturing Frederick Douglass highlight that by documenting all of the known separate poses of Douglass as opposed to reproductions of existing photographs. In fact, we have a number. Douglass, for Douglass, there are 168 separate poses. And we have a rough rank of 2nd through 5th place. Second was George Custer, the boy general during the Civil War, who was a shameless self-promoter. There are 155 separate photographs of Custer. Red Cloud, the indigenous chief and leader, there are 128 photographs. Walt Whitman, 127. Lincoln, 126. U.S. Grant is a contender, but the scholar who's probably most familiar with the Grant Archive of Photography is estimated only about 150. So there's good evidence that Douglass was the most photographed American in the 19th century. And that's significant for a number of reasons, the most prominent of which is to suggest that Douglass was a public face of the nation. A Black man was a public face of the nation, ironically, at a time in which for much of that period, slavery still ran rampant, and the scourge of racism was ubiquitous in the country, and even, in my view, even more so than it is now. Douglass's passion for photography, however, has been largely ignored, and raises the question, why would someone who devoted his life to ending slavery, racism, championing civil rights, human rights, be so in love with photography? There are three reasons for that. One is that the medium of photography from the time of its invention in 1839 by Louis Daguerre and Henry Fox Talbot, both Europeans, was seen as a democratic medium. And although photography was invented in Europe, Americans quickly fell in love with photography, and photography circulated far more widely in the United States than any other country. Americans photographed themselves and their family members and friends far more than in Europe. And we know that from the 19th century literature on photography and other writings and the extant photographs today. And Daguerre himself, and in 19th century people recognized it was a democratic medium because it was the first time, photography offered the first time in which a working class, someone who was not wealthy, or at least upper middle class, could have an accurate portrait of himself or family members taken. Before photography, if you wanted a family portrait, if you wanted your own portrait to be preserved or sent to friends and loved ones, you could have a miniaturist, a painter who did a small painting, which was still required upper middle class, or you could have a portrait painter, which was actually quite expensive. You needed a fair amount of money. Photography allowed people, the poorest servant girl, as Douglas said in one of his speeches. In fact, as I said, he spoke more widely on photography than others. So one is the democratic nature of photography. Douglas also recognized, and it's accurate, the degree to which photography was closely aligned with freedom. The love of photography in the United States, the vogue of photography was chiefly, almost exclusively in the free states. The slave states vigorously suppressed and censored photographs because of the truth value. And the truth value photographer highlighted and captured the essential humanity of the subject, of the person sitting for the photograph. And in North America and the United States, 95% of all photographs were portraits of people. And slave owners recognized that if we allow photographs to circulate in the South, it could send a message that slaves are equal in their humanity. It could also lead to the people running away, and so they vigorously suppress photography, much as they suppress other forms of free speech, debate, petition. In fact, one of the defining aspects of slavery is that it's a state of war. Without violence or the threat of violence, slavery doesn't exist. And two, it's a totalitarian state, meaning that in all slave societies, not just in the United States, but in the rest of the history of slave societies, whether it's ancient Greece, Rome, the Caribbean, Brazil, et cetera, is one of the characteristics of slave owners. They vigorously suppress civil liberties, free speech, debate, petition, because if they allow that and allow slaves to describe the inhumanity and horrors of slavery, that will profoundly threaten the institution. The third reason is the democratic nature of photography is that photography and Douglas came of age together. In fact, Douglas's first photograph occurred right at the time he became a paid public lecturer for the American Anti-Slavery Society, which was a time in which abolitionism, the idea of men and women, blacks and whites, all being equal and should have equal rights under the Constitution and under the country, or at least equal rights in a democracy, started to become circulated. The first known photograph of Frederick Douglass, as I said, is right after he joined William Lloyd Garrison's American Anti-Slavery Society as a public figure, as a paid lecturer. He escapes from slavery in 1838. Gives an address at the National American Anti-Slavery Society Convention, is a brilliant lecturer. It started lecturing even as a slave on the Eastern Shore surreptitiously. And soon after this, he has his first photograph taken. And this, in a sense, captures Douglas's pose as a photography, or as a subject for photography. This is, as I said, the first known portrait of Douglas as a very young man. And notice that he's staring directly at us. He's staring at the viewer. At the time, photography manuals taught photographers to position or pose the sitter so that they stared anywhere but into the camera lens. They wanted them looking in a visionary gaze or looking up or beyond the camera lens. And Douglas defied that convention because he wanted to stare down his viewers and in a sense insisted upon a kind of equal humanity. But the first few known photographs of Douglas, he's experimenting with his look. This is another beautiful early photograph of Douglas where he poses in what photographers would call a visionary gaze, looking above beyond the camera lens. He was always well dressed, as reflected in this photograph. And here is another experimental pose where it's a beautiful contemplative pose. He's kind of looking down, a bit askance, but his suits, his ties, his shirts were representative of always being dressed up for the camera lens, much as he was in public. And then he lands on his signature look, which was to stare down viewers, to confront viewers, which was not representative. And part of the reason he did this was to demand equality, to demand respect. It's a look of respect, dignity. It was, in a sense, a visual voice of democracy. One of the many reasons why Douglas sat for his photograph, it was his claim to citizenship. In a sense, Douglas used photography in the same way he used writing, in the same way he uses oratory, to say that in these art forms, in these forms of communication, I can out-citizen white citizens at their own game of democracy. So it's why he dressed up elaborately before he gave a speech. He visited the venue, made sure the lighting was correct. He out-orated the leading white orators. He out-photographed the leading white subjects for photographers. And he outwrote, as a nonfiction writer, the leading white nonfiction writers. And in fact, around the time of this half-plate daguerreotype in 1852, was one of an anti-slavery advocate, not even an abolitionist, saw a photograph, if not this particular daguerreotype, one like it, and referred to Douglas as majestic in his wrath. And I think it wonderfully summarizes the signature pose from the very first 1841 photograph until really through the Civil War. Douglas soon would become, and here's another example of a photograph of being majestic in his wrath. This is an engraving cut from a daguerreotype, in other words, a photograph that's now lost to us. And an engraving cut from a photograph means that it's fairly close in its accuracy. It's very close in its accuracy without the detail of the photograph, and his fists are clenched as though he's willing to stand up to anyone who would deny him equal citizenship. And it's also captures a central theme of that great second autobiography. He did experiment with some profile poses here, but that was not that common. And he also recognized the power of photography, particularly Lincoln also recognized the power of photography. He was comparatively unknown when he ran for president. When he goes to New York to give his Cooper Union address, the first thing he does before he gives his Cooper Union address is to sit for Matthew Brady in Matthew Brady's studio. And it's the first photograph of Lincoln that really shows him presidential, that suggests that he is could be a national statesman. Previous photographs, Lincoln was renowned for having a bad hair day, and a lot of the previous photographs look like that. And this photograph then becomes essentially ubiquitous in the press. Harper's Weekly cuts a print from it, or cuts an engraving from it based on the photograph on the front page of Harper's Weekly. And then it becomes ubiquitous as a campaign button and in other forms during the campaign. And it was so influential at a time in which Americans wanted to be able to visualize public figures. They wanted to be able to recognize visibly who their political candidates were for office. According to Matthew Brady, Lincoln, after what he was elected, wrote Brady a letter of thanks saying, your portrait elected me. And Douglas actually said much the same thing. He said, and this is a quote, the portrait elects the president. So it captures both the political as well as cultural power of photography at this age, or at this time period. Here's Douglas, several years after Lincoln, also of the photograph by Carl Gears, and he now is on the cover of Harper's Weekly. It would be like someone being on the cover of Time magazine, being at the time in which Time magazine was the most popular magazine circulating in the United States. Douglas, a number of Douglas's photographs capture him with famous people or in significant poses. Almost all of Douglas's portraits were public portraits. It was a way of sending a message that he was, as I said, a public face of America. There are, and some of the photographs, like this one, captures him at the arts that he really was, if not unparalleled, was one of the great artists of. Here he's mid-speech at a Tuskegee Institute, the Black college, and he's standing, and three people to his left is the young Booker T. Washington. Here is Douglas at an 1850 abolitionist convention, an integrated convention. Douglas is sitting down. Behind him is his friend Garrett Smith giving a radical speech. Douglas will then give this keynote speech later. Douglas working at his desk. He's being shown in the act of one of his great art forms, writing, as a way to picture, to visualize what he is doing. Douglas was comparatively uninterested in family photographs, in the private self, in the mementos of family, which have become so common in the 20th and 21st century. Most of the photographs, as I said, are public political poses, although there are a few. This is, we discovered this, it's a photograph of Douglas it's the only photograph of Douglas with any of his children. It's Annie from 1853, and it's actually a print from a lost daguerreotype of Douglas, not in great shape. Annie is very young here. She dies in 1860 from a flu. Aunt Douglas was close to him. It's a very touching photograph, but it's rare for Douglas. Here's another family, one of the very few family portraits. Douglas with his second wife, Helen Pitts. Helen's sister is behind the table facing us. Again, not something that circulated and was comparatively rare in the corpus. Here's Douglas with Helen Pitts at their honeymoon in Niagara Falls, New York. They're actually in a photographer's studio. They're not actually sitting on rocks in front of Niagara Falls. It was common in photo studios to have elaborate backdrops and elaborate chairs. And you see the fakeness if you actually look at the waves intersecting with the rocks in the lower right. You recognize that it's fake. And so part of it is Douglas, in a sense, he looks like he's half smirking, having a laugh, for people who think that they're actually sitting on rocks at Niagara. A number of leading figures photographed Douglas, and as well as figures who are not known. Photography itself was one of the most democratic mediums. The barriers to entry were very small to become a professional photographer. Unlike other arts like painting or sculpture, you didn't have to study or work with a master painter or sculptor to say if you're Black or you're woman, you're not allowed. As long as you could read, and if you had the time to and willingness to experiment with chemicals, cameras did not cost that much. If you had 3 to 6 months to experiment, you could master the art of photography. Many photographers just had a horse and wagon, and went from town to town, satisfying the truly insatiable demand. One of the leading photographers, in my view, not well known, as I said, even now, is Lydia Cadwell. Took 2 beautiful cabinet cards of Douglas after the war in 1875, and you see the richness in both the soft tones, the backdrop, the expression that Douglas has on his face. So Douglas sat for women, he sat for African Americans, he sat for men, he sat for anyone who he felt could represent him well. In one sense, his understanding of the relationship between himself and the subject and the camera and the photographer it was almost a pas de trois, a dance for 3, that a great photograph resulted from a very good photographer who understood light, a good camera, and Douglas himself being part of that art. And so he always played an important role. This is Cornelius Batty, African-American photographer, 2 years before Douglas died. Here's Phineas Headley and James Reed. That was an interracial team, black and white photographer teaming up, and they're photographing Douglas with his grandson, Joseph. Joseph was an internationally known concert violinist, and it was at a venue in which Douglas gave a speech and his grandson played the violin, and is captured, this public event is captured by Headley and Reed in this cabinet card. James Heron Easton, African-American radical abolitionist and radical egalitarian, photographs Douglas. He was from Minnesota in the Midwest in 1869. James Presley Ball, another African-American photographer in Cincinnati, then major city known as the gateway to the West. Ball was characterized by the leading art magazine in Boston, which was the cultural capital of the country, at least until the end of the Civil War when New York took over. The magazine referred to Ball as the preeminent photographer in the country. And in fact, they did a spread of Ball's Daguerrean gallery, his photographic gallery, which is shown right here, and gives you a sense of what it was like going into the gallery, the photo shop or place of a successful photography. There's a parlor where you sit, and as you wait to have your photo taken, you look at other portraits to help you decide how you want your portrait taken. And for many photographers, you could sit and wait until they developed and develop the portrait, and you can walk out with your portraits. But the fact that Ball, this African-American, was defined as the preeminent photographer by Gleason's Pictorial, this art magazine, is, I think, characteristic of the democratic nature of the medium. Matthew Douglas also was photographed by now very famous photographers, Matthew Brady, in this carte de visite. There are different kinds of photographs, and Matthew Brady captures the literal and figurative light in Douglas's eye. And you see the, I think, really subtle but rich polka dots on Douglas's vest. I would love a vest myself like that. John Howe Kent photographs Douglas in Rochester, New York, where he lived in some of his most radical during a period from 1847 until after the Civil War, radical period of his life. And it's in his kind of Rochester Russian cap and coat. It gets very cold in Russia. John Howe Kent was also very well known. George Kendall Warren was another very well-known photographer. Warren was based in Boston. He often photographed, not every year, but often every other year or so. He typically would photograph the graduating class of Harvard and then go to Yale and sometimes Princeton, photograph celebrities when they came to Boston, and photograph Douglas when he came to Boston in 1879. And Douglas used Warren's photograph as the basis for an engraving for the first of two editions, the first edition of Life and Times, which he then expanded for the final 1893 edition of his last autobiography. Douglas also appears in Lincoln's second inaugural. He was invited, he attended the inaugural, he had a front row seat. You see Lincoln behind the podium delivering his famous second inaugural. Douglas I've circled, and so you see how close they are. Lincoln saw Douglas in the crowd. In fact, after the address, Douglas attended the reception in the White House, and when he enters the elegant East Room, Lincoln is surrounded by a crowd of whites. He sees Douglas enter. He raises his long arm and he says, "Hello, Mr. Douglas, I saw you in the crowd today." Of course he does. You see how close Douglas is. "What did you think of my address? There is no man in these United States whose opinion I value more than yours." And Douglas responded, "Mr. President, that was a sacred effort." And that's an exact quote. We know that from several sources, one of whom a woman who was standing next to Lincoln when he said this, kept a daily diary and recorded it in her diary that night. So it's not something that Douglas or someone else made up 20 years later. At the second inaugural also, I've also circled John Wilkes Booth. He's in the balcony above Lincoln, scoping out Lincoln in the hopes of trying to assassinate him, which he does not much after the second inaugural. Booth was a Southerner through and through. Douglas defied the convention of photography, not just from 1840s through the Civil War, typically staring directly in the camera lens, confronting the viewer, but also in refusing largely props. As I pointed out in some of these images, often photographers would use elaborate props, a desk, chair, backdrop like Niagara Falls. Douglas usually did not use props, did not have props with him when he sat for the photograph. When he did use a prop, it was usually significant. So here he's holding, you can barely see it, his hands are around the cane that Mary Todd Lincoln gave him after President was assassinated as a token of Lincoln's friendship with Frederick Douglass and Douglas's influence on him, frankly. Here is Douglas as staring us down again, and he is elaborately dressed in a long coat. He has a thick book, what looks like a scholarly book he's presenting himself as the public intellectual, sitting at a flowered tablecloth chair, but with a book, is suggesting that he's a reader, he's a writer, he's an intellectual. Here's Douglas near the end, a year before he dies. He's living in Anacostia, part of Washington, D.C., and it's a middle-class community. And in fact, Anacostia, if you go there, and his beautiful state, it's now the National Park Service site for Frederick Douglass. If you go to the road, you can look down on the U.S. Capitol. And Douglass was known as the Lion of Anacostia, and he acquires a chair with lion arms, and so he has a hand on the lion. The Lion of Anacostia has his hand on a chair with the lion as the arm. Douglass almost never was photographed with a smile. He never wanted to be taken as a so-called happy slave. This is the only known photograph of Douglass noticeably and explicitly smiling, and it's a year before he died. He is internationally renowned, internationally famous. In fact, when he dies, the Chicago Tribune and a number of white papers state that Douglass is the most significant American in the last 50 years, which is a major statement for white newspapers to say. And that's essentially a quote from the Chicago Tribune. So Douglass was not interested in photography. Or, I mean, not interested in using the photograph for personal reasons for the most part. And one of the other characteristics is, now I'm going to show you a series of photographs, some you've seen before, is to highlight another aspect of Douglass's photographic persona. It captures the continual evolution of Douglass, both visually as well as in his writings and in his words. The most famous speech that Douglass gave in his lifetime was called Self-Made Man. Most of us are familiar with the idea of self-made men or self-made women. Self-made women was invented and the term came into use in the 1870s. Self-made man started getting circulated in 1842. Many Americans, both then and especially now, think of self-making as rising up and getting rich. For Douglass, he was explicit about defining what a self-made man or woman was, and it's a self who is continually evolving. Continually growing and evolving, a self who is in a state of continual flux. Because what Douglass understood is that slavery and racism is based on fixity. It's based on the understanding of a human being, of a self, in a state of stasis, as forever fixed in one state or one condition. So by continually evolving himself, by imagining and realizing oneself as continually evolving in continual state of flux, it explodes the very understandings and definitions and justifications for both slavery and racism. And he captures this in the evolution too of his photographs. And one of the ways he does so is in his sartorial style and in his facial hair. And let me just draw attention to the facial hair. He continually experimented, much as he does in his writing, in his oratory, in his photographs. He continually experiments. In this early photograph, it shows him clean shaven. Here he has some chin whiskers. Here the chin whiskers go up his chin, so they become longer. Here he grows, by 1856, he grows a full beard. he cuts down the chin whiskers, the beard becomes fuller. During the war, he is a trendsetter. Many of the facial hair, much of the facial hair that he depicts on himself, he's a trendsetter in much of it. This became known as the walrus mustache, and Douglas was one of the first to present himself in a walrus mustache. Here's Douglas in a ponytail. He grows his hair out enough so he can put in a ponytail in the back, and doesn't keep the ponytail look, but experiments with it. Again, continually experimenting and evolving. He grows his whiskers out so he's now in a full beard. Then he shaves his chin and you have the bushy sideburns. And then he grows his hair out into a full beard. And this is one of 2 deathbed photos of Douglas taken after his death. So his photographs capture the sense of radical reform, not riches. In fact, many people recognize that at the time. I mean, Lincoln said of Douglas after their first meeting that Douglas was one of the most meritorious, if not the most meritorious man in the United States because of his continual evolution and the mastery with which he had already achieved as a speaker, writer, and image maker. Douglas's portraits, and I think it's significant to the afterlife of Douglas's photographs, his portraits continued to circulate in the 20th and 21st centuries. They become an important, I think, a very important visual legacy, inspiring art that continued to break down racial barriers. In one sense, I think it's important to recognize in Douglas someone who took advantage of the new technology of his day in much the same way that activists take advantage of new technologies today, from Twitter and Facebook to cell phone photos and videos. Increasing with the rise of Black Lives Matter, Blacks won't leave home without a camera. In my view, the current protest and the activism that we see today in parts began, or it exploded after the murder of George Floyd. George Floyd was captured, his death was captured on video, a moving form of photography. And the truth value of that video resembled the truth value of the photographs that Douglas sat for time and again. So in a sense, there's a straight line from Douglas's love of and sensitivity to knowledge of the cultural and political power of photography to the way in which Black Lives Matter and other activists use it. So today, many Blacks won't leave home without a camera. Douglas would have said the same thing had cameras been something that one could take easily themselves. It was an age, though, when Douglas lived, that you really needed, as I said, 3 to 6 months until the Brownie camera becomes popular, really beginning around it's invented, but doesn't become popular until after Douglas's death. And that after Douglas dies, the era of the snapshot becomes popular. Douglas inspired 20th and 21st century artists to create thousands of murals, sculptures, paintings, prints, drawings, postage stamps, and magazine covers based on the photographs as a way to continue the torch fighting for equality, human rights, civil rights, and the effort to fulfill the ideals of democracy. Douglas remained a public face of the nation in the 20th century through the afterlife of these photos. And let me just give you a few examples. Douglas appears on the cover of Life magazine, and you see the accuracy with which it appears. It's based on a daguerreotype at the Met from an unknown photographer from the 1850s. Here is, this has unfortunately been burned down, but it's a few blocks from where I live in Cambridge. It was a big, beautiful, and this is just a detail of a mural at the King Open School, as I said, a few blocks from where I lived, and which David Fichter was a teacher, and he and his class created this large mural called A Vision of Community. Douglas, it's based on the cover of the Life magazine that I just showed you. It was taken down because the King Open School was old. It had a new building was created, and they unfortunately didn't preserve this beautiful mural. Here's Lloyd Lilly. Douglas has a bronze sculpture in Faneuil Hall in Boston, and it's based on the engraving from A Lost Photograph of My Bondage and My Freedom. Sculptures relied heavily on the photographs in order to craft and create the portrait, the head and shoulders of him in sculpture. Here's another mural of Douglas, and there are thousands of murals that include Douglas. These is just a small example, also from Roxbury, or from Massachusetts, the Boston area. Roxbury's Deborah Browder and a colleague, and it's based on John White-Hearn's 1863 daguerreotype. And Douglas becomes the basis of two postage stamps. This one in 1995. And notice the artist, Douglas, has his finger pointing down. The artist turns it up. So it's a nice little change that, yeah, in a sense, there are a number of ways to interpret it, but it's clearly based on the Samuel Fassett photograph from 1864. There are murals of Douglas outside the United States. Douglas, when he fled to England, Ireland, and Scotland after the success of his first autobiography, because he's still legally a fugitive, he fell in love with many Irish leaders, and to this day, the Irish see Douglas as a great symbol of freedom and democracy. And this is a large anti-racism mural in Belfast, Northern Ireland, which had been the heart of the Troubles against the Irish. And it's based on Matthew Brady's carte de visite of 1877. A similar mural was done by Dan Devaney in New Bedford. It's a labor history mural and advocating for jobs being kept in New Bedford. New Bedford has, both when Douglas lived there and today, a disproportionately large African-American population. And here is Douglas in a the psychedelic Douglas of late 1960s, early 70s. It's based on Dennis Bourdain's cabinet card, and you see the kind of psychedelic outfit that Douglas wore. Here's another mural with Douglas, and along with three other Black leaders, W.B. Du Bois, Elijah Muhammad, and Malcolm X in Boston. And I focus just on Boston, but in virtually every medium-sized to major city, there are murals of Douglas, which our book only can document a small number of them. Here's Richard Blake using Samuel Miller's daguerreotype from 1852 to craft this, this beautiful sculpture of Douglas in 2013. Byron Peck from 1965 and St. George in 2013 in Los Angeles. There are two murals of Douglas based on John White-Hearn's 1863 photograph of Douglas. So Douglas remains a public face of the country in his afterlife. Eudophia, the Bread for the City, it's in Washington, D.C., based on 1858 daguerreotype. And the last one is one that you are no doubt familiar with. It's the J. Hall Carpenter beautiful statue of Douglas in Easton, Maryland, and is based partly on at least the head and the face, Matthew Brady's daguerreotype, his cabinet, his stereo card of Douglas in 1877. Douglas's visual legacy protested lynching and segregation. It lobbied for civil rights and celebrated Black power. It dignified the Black body that white Americans have so often tried to destroy. In the largest sense, one might say that Douglas helped launch one of the great battles in American history, a battle between racist stereotypes that all of you are familiar with, and I didn't want to show them because of the profoundly racist nature of these stereotypes. It's a battle between the racist stereotypes and dignified self-possession. Across 50 years of photographs, Douglas fought for the public image of African Americans as equal citizens. Across the next 120 years, in his visual afterlife, the photos have fought on. Thank you.